Let's talk a little bit about cutting angles and cutting power. Hey folks, so I've noticed something recently which I thought I'd share with you guys, and funnily enough, some of you won't like this, but funnily enough this comes out of some experiences with the cook racks, which I know some of you love, some of you hate. It's a very divisive instrument, but don't worry, this is a video about swords, not about the cook racks, and it comes out of some comments looking at the results of cutting with that cook racks and also thinking about how kukris are used, which obviously is related because of the angle, but then also looking at how swords are used, and obviously based on what people have been saying, and then me thinking back to things I've read in 19th century, particularly in some cases earlier as well, period sources that talk about cutting methods and cutting angles. Now, we've spoken a fair amount in the past, although not recently, about the different ways of cutting. And one of the things that always irks me slightly with the modern tatami mat cutting community is the idea that there's only one way to cut. And this is the complete antithesis of what we find in the historical sources, because the historical sources from Europe and the Middle East and Asia and all over very clearly, very clearly state that for good or bad, I'm not saying that one is right and one is wrong, but for good or bad, they state that there were different ways of cutting. And this is almost now unquestionable historical fact, that the way of cutting with a tulwar was demonstrably different to the way of cutting with a sabre, with a European sabre or a cutlass. Or indeed, the way of cutting with the shamshir or the kilich was different to the way of cutting with the kukri. So there were different ways of cutting, and there are different ways of cutting. Now, some people would argue, oh, well, the best way to get to a tatami mat is to do this and only this. Well, a tatami mat is a thing. If we look at the 19th century cutting sources, you know, basically the main cutting sources that we've got, the main historical cutting sources, we see that they're cutting different objects. They're cutting lead bars, they're cutting dead sheep, they're cutting silk handkerchiefs, they're cutting hanging fruit, they're cutting fish, they're cutting, if we go to the Middle Eastern sources, layers of wet felt, they're cutting clay, they're cutting all kinds of things. So we've got loads and loads actually of historical material, looking at even broom handles as well. We're looking at all sorts of different things they cut, and they used different swords and they cut in different ways. So there was a historical acknowledgement that you would use different swords for cutting different targets, and you would use different swords in different ways. That seems to be indisputable historical fact. Okay, and I don't care about anyone's modern interpretation. Bam, that's black and white historical fact. So we know that in the 19th century there were different ways of cutting because it's spoken about. Okay, they literally, and not just one source, like dozens of sources talk about the different ways of cutting, and I can think of probably a dozen sources off the top of my head that talk about the different ways that Europeans, or at least British people, cut with sabres compared to the way that Indian people, for example, cut with a tulwar. And I've spoken about this in many previous videos, but equally there were different ways of cutting in Europe. There are British sources which talk about the fact that the people cut with a Schlager, for example, in German sabre fencing, in a different way to how people cut in Britain and France with the sabre. Literally, you cut at different angles, you move the body in a slightly different way, and it generates a slightly different physical effect with different strengths and weaknesses. There's no one is better, one is worse. It's just these are different ways of skinning a cat, basically. And it's very clear as well, or at least in the British sources, they suggest that the Menschy effect and the Schlager ways of cutting influenced the military sabre ways of cutting as well. And when you look at sources like Christman and the various other, I think, although I haven't studied those sources, this is probably represented there with their very high hand way of cutting and the use of a leather finger loop inside the hilt. This is something that's quite different to what we see in Britain and France. And not to say that Britain and France were always the same, or that there's only one way in those as well. There are also different methods of cutting discussed within British treatises as well. Right, so that's all dealt with. Something I noticed is generally speaking, cutting divides into several different categories, but for the purposes of this video, I'm going to oversimplify slightly here. For the purposes of this video, we could look at the casting out of the tip or we could look at keeping the tip back in and sinking the hand. Now, what anybody who watches lots of my videos or has been watching for a while will recognise is this is a little bit like the difference that I have spoken about between the so-called drawing cut, as the 19th century people called it as well, of the shamshir or the tulwar, and incidentally this is kind of both of those because it's a shamshir blade on a tulwar hilt. So the drawing cut of the Eastern sword, or Oriental or Asian sword, as it was often referred to in 19th century sources, the drawing cut, or in fact, you can reverse it, the pushing cut, okay, because they talk about, particularly on horseback, they talk about pushing with the edge like this and letting it slide past. Okay, so we've got the drawing cut and the pushing cut. That's just, one is the reverse of the other. It's a bit like the down and up in longsword. Versus the casting out of the tip of the thing as if you were hitting with a stick of the European sources. Now, there are strengths and weaknesses to both these things. Clearly, straight line versus bent line, that reaches further than that, okay, very obviously. However, the edge alignment is far likely to go crooked and go wrong with that than it is with that, okay? These are all things that I've spoken about before. So, you know, different strengths and weaknesses. But what we're going to talk about here are muscle groups, okay? Now, this is where we come back to the Kukri. So something that someone said, I think about 2 or 3 people observed this actually. So I couldn't work out why this, for such a small axe, seemed to be cutting so well, so potently. And the question has to be, is it the axe or is it the user? Is it psychological? Is it muscular? What is it? Is it to do with edge alignment? Yeah, in some cases it can just be to do with the fact it's a sharper axe. Okay, let's put that aside and assume that that's not the main reason. Is there some other reason why this crooked angle should somehow make it more comfortable or feel more potent, more powerful? You know, why does, and a lot of people go, oh, well, there's no other axes that are shaped like this. Well, there are kind of some. There are some Native American weapons which are shaped a bit like this, and there are clubs and maces which are shaped like this, and there are kukris, and there are falcatas, and there are kopis, and there are kopesh, and there's various other weapons that are shaped like this, okay? So before you get your knickers in a twist about the fact that this axe, oh, I don't agree with this axe because it doesn't look like a proper axe, there are lots of other weapons that have this forward angle. And surprise, surprise, I noticed that John Latham of Wilkinson Sword, somewhat of an expert, you know, basically made the Wilkinson Sword Company great after Henry Wilkinson died, and he knew his stuff. He was also a very keen fencer, incidentally. I've got records of him fencing against people you would know, like John Musgrave Waite and people like that. He knew Hutton and all of those. But he knew what he was talking about when he was talking about the design of swords. He really did. I've read his, you know, what he's written down, what he's left behind, and he really knew what he was talking about. And he does talk about weapons that lead in front of the hand, and his view was that, well, I won't go fully into that, that's probably for another video, but his view was that they were advantageous for chopping. So, we all know that kukris chop great. Why do they chop great? Well, that's a complicated question. I don't think everyone agrees on the answer. But one thing I noticed, and as I say, at least two or three people mentioned this, was that when I was chopping with this, because it's cast forward of the hand and because of the angle that this meets the target at, because it's cast forward, instead of necessarily flinging the thing out like I would with an axe, out to being in line with my forearm, instead I sunk, because my hand was forced to be sunk down, I sunk my upper arm, shoulder and back muscles and body mass into the chops. So instead of flinging it out, and this is where it comes back to the swords, remember, instead of flinging the axe out like this, okay, instead I was putting my upper body mass and my larger muscle groups, rather than my forearm and my wrist rotation, I was keeping a stiffer wrist. This is starting to sound familiar to some of you. I was keeping a stiffer wrist, and I was using my elbow instead of my wrist as the point of rotation, and the shoulder, and I was sinking my body weight into it. Now, this is a theory. I'm not saying this is right, but I think it's a very interesting one. Could it be that the secret of the Kukri, if there is a secret of Kukri, or to make it more palatable for those of you who don't like the Kukri, the secret of the Kukri might not be the shape of the weapon. It might be that the shape of the weapon forces the user to use it in a certain way, which, whilst it might have less reach, is more effective at chopping. Because the natural inclination, if I just, well, I grab the sabre again because it's what's near to hand. The natural inclination, certainly of, and so Victorian sources being Victorian, they do talk about like different groups of people having different tendencies, which, you know, there's a big topic. But they say that the natural inclination of British people is to hit like they're hitting with a stick. Okay, or hitting with an axe. And in fact, in the Napoleonic period, the British cavalry are likened to using their swords like they were chopping with axes. Although axes chop pretty well. So anyway, is that a criticism? I don't know. I think they just meant without subtlety. But we've got the natural tendency, a lot of people in the world have a natural tendency to cast the thing out. But what if the natural tendency isn't the best thing to do in some scenarios? Not saying in all. I'm not saying that people who chop wood for a living are doing it wrong, because clearly I'm not qualified to say that. But what if in some situations with shorter implements against shorter material, against different types of materials, that there might be more efficient ways of doing things? And clearly we can't say that the Indian way of using a talwar is wrong. It's just different. It's just a completely different way of doing it to how sabres were usually used in Europe, certainly in Britain and France. So it's not that one is wrong and one is right. They just have different strengths and weaknesses. Why did they come about to those two different ethoses of using those swords? Why did they use them so differently? I don't know. I can't answer that question for you. I can only guess. It could be to do in some cases with the way the blades are made, could be to do with the types of materials that were available. Who knows? It could be the types of armour or clothing that was worn, the types of, in other words, the type of target that being attacked. Or it could be to do with the martial arts system and the movement system, and that kind of led to the development of certain types of ways of cutting. Who knows? It's all supposition. But what is interesting is I have noticed now that if the people are correct, that the way I use the Kukri, it's not that the Kukri axe is really different to any other axe, except for the shape. It's that the shape makes me use different muscle groups and use the object in a different way that feels different to me, and maybe gives the illusion or maybe gives the reality that I'm applying more force or having a greater effect on the target for the amount of energy that I'm putting in. In other words, that it feels more efficient. And certainly, I think people who are used to using the talwar in the way that it's always described being used in the sources, sinking the hand in, time and time again, these sources say that they keep a stiff wrist, which is why we've got this disc pommel, because if you don't extend the wrist, then the pommel isn't a problem, but equally the pommel assists, because as you pull down, if we just look here, as you're pulling the hand downwards, it is going in the direction of the pommel, okay? So if you're pulling down in the direction of the pommel, and that's where the energy is going downwards instead of straight forwards, if it's going downwards, that pommel actually assists you applying force to the hilt, which transfers through to the blow, of course, to the cut. So maybe it's, and they talk about using the larger muscle groups, using the shoulder, rotating from the elbow. Incidentally, anybody who's studying Italian sabre out there will be going, yes, cutting from the elbow. Yes, cutting from the elbow is more powerful than cutting from the wrist. So if they're using the full body mass here of this rotation, this is similar to how Kukris, surprise, surprise, Kukris come from Nepal, which is just above India, and therefore the Kukraks are being used and you're using bigger muscle groups. Right, so that's the theory. Don't know if it's right. Have a talk about it. Give me your comments underneath, your thoughts. Maybe we've got some people out there who know more about this from a anatomical and physical point of view. Some people who do maybe strength training or stuff that absolutely, I think it's unquestionable, you're using bigger muscle groups when you're doing this motion, but equally you're using your body weight more efficiently than when you're just casting something out from the arm. At a cost, at less reach, possibly less speed. The final thing I want to finish on is basket-hilted swords. So again, in 19th century sources, they often mention that whilst the basket hilt is pretty much a perfect, fantastic protection for the hand. The disadvantage is, to use their own lingo of the time, they say it limits the play of the wrist. What's the play of the wrist mean? Well, having read many of these sources, what they're talking about is this type of thing. It means moving the sword from the wrist. Now, ironically, we know that this is exactly what they did do with basket-hilted swords in the 18th century. So if you look at someone like Jay Mars's channel, very competent broadsword and backsword player, basket-hilted sword player, he's looking at Scottish and English sources using basket hilts of the 18th century, and we can go back to the 17th century as well. And they are absolutely doing things from the wrist, moving the sword from the wrist, and they're not only gripping it in a hammer fist, they're gripping it in a handshake grip, and in some cases sticking the thumb up. There are treatises that recommend sticking the thumb up. This hilt's actually too small for me to comfortably do that with, but I'm bigger than the average 19th century person. And so that kind of goes against that. It goes against what 19th century people say. But as a sabre user, okay, and that's where the perspective a lot of these 19th century sources are coming from, as someone who's used to using sabre hilts, indeed, when I try and pick up a basket hilt, it does feel uncomfortable and limiting to me. So it probably would have felt uncomfortable and limiting to them as well if they weren't used to basket hilts. I'm sure people in the 18th century who were used to basket hilts didn't have this problem, but it feels uncomfortable to me anyway, unless the basket hilt is quite a bit bigger. And that means it's heavier and more more uncomfortable to wear and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, so, but the one thing I thought about is maybe at their inception, when we go all the way back into the 16th century, middle of the 16th century, when basket hilts started appearing, maybe some of the people using these weren't bothered about any impediment to the hand, because they weren't cutting like I'm cutting with a sabre, or indeed how we see cutting with things like side swords, or even with the Langmesser, which is quite similar to the sabre actually. Maybe they were doing more like the Tolwar cut. Maybe they were sinking the hand in and cutting more from the elbow. Maybe, and maybe this way of keeping the sword out and cutting very much from the wrist here is something that came later in the 18th century because of facing people with small swords and other things like bayonets and things like this. Maybe it's more of a dueling thing, maybe there were different styles. I think if you look at, arguably if you look at Thomas Page, and if you go back and if you look at things like Swetnam, I think we can maybe see bigger movements with the sword. I don't know. I'm not a specialist on those sources, so it'd be interesting to get feedback. But based on what I've seen with the thoughts coming from the cook racks and using the larger muscle groups, based on the fact that I think that's probably similar to how the Tolwar is used and how that contrasts to how the sabre is used, it maybe has some interesting implication questions for basket hilts, at least at their beginning, and how they were used at the beginning, and maybe why basket hilts that join at the side here weren't seen as a problem in 16th and 17th century Britain in the way that they were seen as a problem in 19th century Britain when people now wanted to move the sword like a sabre. Anyway, I hope that's been interesting and thought-provoking. I'd love to hear your views and opinions on this subject below. Please subscribe, bottom corner down there, give us a like, and I'll see you really, really soon for another video on Schola Gladiatoria channel. Cheers, folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.